The dark side of YouTube is not somewhere that I recommend most people spend a large amount of their time. But with that said, it is an intriguing place to be for anyone that has even the slightest interest in the strange, dark or macabre. And so I've spent a lot of time there of late, researching some of the darkest murders that reside there in order to present them to you all in this week's video. From a young woman whose YouTube career was going from strength to strength before it was callously cut short, to a woman whose own father couldn't stand the shame of his daughter building a YouTube following, leading to her heinous murder, putting an end to her career and life. In total, I've summarised 3 of what I believe to be the darkest, most despicable and evil murders committed by or to YouTubers who were building a following online before these evil acts were committed. Hello and welcome to the Diary of Madmen and Monsters, where we talk about the mad men, women and monsters that inhabit our society, covering well-known and not so well-known cases across the UK and beyond. And if you're fueled by caffeine, true crime and the odd glass of good wine, then you're in the right place and you're going to fit in well. Now, let's get ready because it's time for more true crime. In January 2023, Tiba heard a familiar sound as she sat in her apartment in Istanbul, Turkey. It was the sound of her phone ringing. But when she picked up her phone to see who it was that was calling, her jaw hit the floor as she couldn't believe who it was that was trying to get in contact. The caller ID said Mum. You see, the reason that this was such an astonishing thing to see was because for years now, her relationship with her family had been strained due to a decision she had made a couple of years previous when the family had travelled to Turkey. In 2017, the family, including Tiba, had travelled to the city of Istanbul, and during the trip they had been exposed to a different type of culture than the culture that they were used to. Having grown up in a southern province of Iraq called Aldawania, Tiba had been raised to adhere to the strict traditions of the old Iraq, traditions that forbid women a lot of the freedoms that women in the Western or more Western accepting parts of the world enjoy. But upon seeing the lifestyle of some of the women in Istanbul and realising that she wanted to break free from tradition and live an independent life, Tiba decided not to follow her family home when it was eventually time to return to Iraq and to instead stay in Istanbul to see if she could build the life that she had now begun to dream about. Of course, for traditionally conservative parents like Tiba's, this was almost inconceivable, and her father in particular was dead set against Tiba staying in Istanbul on her own, away from his guidance and control. But regardless, Tiba had decided that this was now just a step she needed to take in her life, and she determined that she was going to stay and build a new life for herself in Istanbul, regardless what her family thought about the decision. And this is exactly what she did. She created a brand new life for herself, one filled with freedom, adventure and fun. And it is here in Istanbul that she discovered YouTube, where she quickly amassed a 30,000 strong following from sharing videos about her daily life, about her experiences being a young Iraqi woman living abroad, and her thoughts on the cultural differences between Iraq and Istanbul. She also connected with other Iraqi people who had decided to make the same change she herself had made, and they helped to strengthen the confidence Tiba had in herself and in the decision that she had made. But behind the scenes of the life updates and the public persona Tiba had created on YouTube and social media, things between herself and her family were still fraught with difficulty, with her family becoming even more offended by the decisions Tiba had decided to make due to the fact that she had now decided to parade them across the internet for all to see. These actions, her family said, had brought shame on her family, and especially upon her father, who, in their culture, was now judged to be a father who cannot keep his own daughter under control. So, In January 2023, when she received the unexpected call from her mother, she was incredibly surprised. Should she answer? Should she leave it? We can imagine that these were the thoughts running through her mind as she looked at the screen with nervous anticipation. What we do know is that she did indeed answer it, and upon speaking with her mother, Tiba was glad she had done so. Her mother was filled with emotion, and as they spoke, her mother suggested that she was looking to make amends and reconcile, asking and begging Tiba to come to Iraq and visit her and the rest of her family. After the call, Tiba was elated. She had finally found some hope that the rift that seemed to be growing between herself and her family could finally be repaired. However, though she was optimistic about the trip, she knew she also had to be cautious. If the prior run-in she had had with members of her family regarding her life choices had taught her anything, it was that taking things slowly and tentatively was going to be the best approach. So she decided to plan to meet her mother separately from the rest of her family at a friend's home in Baghdad, over 100 miles away from their family home, in a different part of the country. That way, she could reconnect with her mother and also look to feel out her mother's thoughts on the rest of the family's feelings in reaction to the coming reunion. She would then, she thought, gradually navigate reconciling with the rest of her family from there. So, on January the 31st, 2023, Tiba arrived in Baghdad, excited and nervous about meeting up with her mother and mending the rift that had separated them for so long. After travelling from the airport, she arrived at her friend's home, and upon collecting her bag from the back of the car, she nervously prepared herself for the coming reunion. Apprehensively, Tiba walked into her friend's house, expecting to be met by the open arms of her mother awaiting her arrival. However, unfortunately for Tiba, this simply wasn't to be. As she pushed open the door and walked in, she was met with a room full of anger and spite. Her full family had gathered there, waiting for her return to Iraq so that they could ambush her and unleash the years of hateful opinions they had harboured. Tiba stood there, realising that she had walked into an ambush, as she was now surrounded by a group of people who were supposed to be family, but who at this point seemed more like enemies. What made this even worse is that this ambush had been set up by her mother of all people, the one person she was hoping would be able to help her rectify the divide that had been so apparent between herself and her family this past few years. As she stood there, with her family verbally beating her down for choosing a life of freedom and happiness over a life of traditional values, her attempts to explain her choices fell on deaf ears and were met with what could only be described as disdain, with her family now forcibly trapping her, allowing her no escape. Suddenly, things heightened, and Tiba felt herself being physically controlled by her family members. She was then forcibly drugged, leaving her unable to resist her family's, who now seemed more like captors, demands. Immediately, they bundled her into an awaiting car and transported her back the 100 miles south to their family home in Elysium province. Once home, an immediate argument ensued, with her father berating her for her choice to shame him and the family and showcase it across the internet. He said that she had brought dishonour on the family and that he was disappointed in her choices, particularly her choice to live with her Syrian boyfriend, who she was planning on getting married to at some point. The argument went on and on, with Tiba eventually growing tired and weak, both emotionally and physically, deciding to retire to her room to rest and recuperate and to try and work out what to do next. In the early hours of the morning, as Tiba slept, her father, who said he was overcome with a strong desire to cleanse the family's honour, crept into her bedroom, stood over her bed, and as she lay there soundly, he placed his hands around his own daughter's neck and strangled her to death, ending the life of a brilliant and brave woman whose only want in life had been to be free from the shackles of tradition and to live a life she wanted to live on her own terms. Her father immediately went to the police and confessed his heinous act, and after being found guilty, was sentenced to just 6 months in prison. showcasing the shocking and downright ridiculous laws Iraq still upholds surrounding the treatment and murder of women under what they term as honour killings. Tiby's death and her father's subsequent lack of appropriate punishment rightfully created uproar across Iraq and elsewhere, with women taking to the streets to campaign for reform surrounding these antiquated laws. That campaign is ongoing, with the old guard in Iraq's political system pushing back completely on changes to their caveman-esque system. In mid-2016, Sherry and Scott Hobbs were walking along the road in their hometown of Plymouth, both feeling good about their lives and what lay ahead of them. They had just recently found out that they were going to have a child and were elated by the thought of their future bringing this new life into the world together. Suddenly, they heard a commotion from behind and what sounded like footsteps running towards them. As they turned, Scott was hit with a flurry of punches that instantly knocked him to the ground. Immediately, he covered up as he felt a barrage of punches hitting his face and body. Again and again he was hit, to the point that he felt it would never end. Time and time again, this monster who had ambushed Scott rained down blows until, thankfully, a security guard from a nearby Tesco intervened and managed to pull the attacker off of Scott and then help Scott up. The police arrived shortly after the intervention of the guard and took a statement from Scott, but Scott felt that they simply didn't take him seriously. The next day, after things had calmed down, Scott was walking past the very same Tesco when he happened to see his attacker once more. Once again, in the middle of the street, his assailant walked up to him and began threatening Scott, saying he was going to get a gun on him. Not sure what else to do at this point, Scott called the police, who arrived and once again just didn't take things seriously. Scott told them that it was the same attacker from the day before, and when police looked at the CCTV in a nearby car park, found that the CCTV didn't cover the area the attack had happened, and only the bike rack area, where it did show said attacker picking his bike up from the rack after the attack had happened. With no arrests made, Scott decided to simply leave the incident and hope to try and avoid his attacker moving forwards. However, this would prove hard to do, as on multiple occasions Scott and Sherry reported that they would see him outside of their home and said that he would often stare at them menacingly whenever they passed him. Eventually, after the birth of their child in 2018, they decided that enough was enough, making the decision to move out of the area and to another part of Plymouth entirely. So who was this delightful chap who had menaced the family so much that they decided to leave town? His name was Jake Davison, a 22-year-old incel who lived in Keyham, Plymouth. Jake was a troubled young man who had grown up in Keyham all of his life, with a single mother who had, by all accounts other than his, been a standout mother, fighting to make sure Jake was given all of the support and love that he needed. Jake, it was said, had been a challenging young man from the start, with everyone who knew him commenting on his unusual behaviour, his extreme tantrums that were said to go beyond mere toddler tantrums and akin to pure rage. His mother, Maxine, eventually decided that something wasn't quite right, and taking him to see a specialist, it was found that Jake had autism. He was then, at the age of 6, placed into a school that specialised in educating kids with autism. The school was called Mount Tamar. Whilst at school, Jake was an incredibly quiet and insular young man. He struggled to socialise and later claimed that he had felt isolated throughout his school days. By his teens, he was watching his classmates socialise, go to parties together, and even enter into relationships with one another. But he could never manage to find the courage to do the same. Simply standing on the sidelines, watching everyone else around him do the things that he longed to do. By his late teens, he had no friends to speak of and had never had a girlfriend, and by now his frustrations were beginning to show. It's at this point that he began to delve into the world of internet forums, where he would spend his time in dark and dingy forums and rabbit holes, listening to incel ideologies and communicating with other incels who had the same thoughts and ideas about life as him. Here, on these forums and websites, he began to communicate with others who harboured hatred and intense feelings towards society and life, and this, unfortunately, would begin to give him the feelings of belonging and attachment that he had craved. He had found a group of kindred spirits, a band of brothers, so to speak, united by the hatred and warped ideologies that seemed to be pointed, for the most part, towards women. It was found that Jake would berate women, including his own mother, for hours on end, writing paragraphs of hate about how women were only ever after money, or that they only wanted the top 10% of males and that the rest of the male population would simply have to want. He would often also ask on said forums how he could become more attractive and be more of a man, only to be met with an abundance of hatred towards his looks and actions, telling him he was fat or ugly and that he had very little chance of attracting women or being successful due to this fact. And, of course, this all fed into the sad narrative he had created for his own life, that he was simply too ugly and unsuccessful to ever get a girlfriend, and that it was everyone else's fault. It was around this time in his late teens that he had also found the platform YouTube, where he would post videos on his channel known as Professor Waffles, again spreading messages of hate towards women and the world, complaining constantly about how unfair life was and talking about how others had what he wanted and how he deserved it more. In 2017, Jake had decided to apply for a shotgun license, and since there was nothing on his record to stop him from being able to get one, Devon and Somerset Police granted his request, and at the age of 18, Jake was an angry young man who was now the proud owner of a shotgun. Over the years, Maxine, Jake's mother, had become increasingly worried about her son, after seeing his actions and hearing his opinions, and due to his fascination with guns, his self-loathing, and his hate-filled rhetoric. She could also see that he was getting worse as he delved deeper and deeper into the online world he inhabited. She tried on multiple occasions to get him help and to raise awareness of her growing concerns, but time after time they fell on deaf ears. She had even mentioned his behaviour to the police, asking them to do a welfare check on him so they could see what he was up to, as she thought his behaviour was concerning and she had believed that he might become a threat. But once again, no action was taken and Jake was left to his own devices to carry on travelling down the same negative path he had always trodden. In 2021, Jake had another altercation involving the police, wherein he had gotten into an altercation with a group of young men and violence was involved. At this point, his gun licence was revoked during the investigation. However, due to the fact that no criminal charges were made, he was given his gun back in July 2021. In the weeks and months leading up to August 2021, Maxine had stepped up her efforts to try and push Jake into leading a more normal life, challenging him on his beliefs surrounding women and life. However, what she didn't know was that Jake's frustration towards her was growing, and that he was sharing more and more hatred online about how his failure with women in life was mainly down to her doing, and that he truly resented her for it. He had a particular hatred for single women on welfare and ranted about them being simple-minded, selfish and money-hungry users of men, completely oblivious to the fact that it was a single woman on welfare that had kept a roof over his head and kept him in what, in comparison to some, is a life of luxury. With their daily life devolving into regular arguments by August the 12th, things came to a head. And at 6 p.m, Maxine called her sister in a panic after locking herself in her bedroom. Quietly, she spoke down the phone, telling her sister that Jake had just attacked her, grabbing her by the throat, and that she was now in her room, terrified for her life. Immediately, Maxine's sister called the police and begged them to get to Maxine's house, as her son had just attacked her in a fit of anger and rage. It still isn't clear what the immediate catalyst for Jake's actions on the 12th of August were, but it's assumed that it was a number of things combined that had lit the fuse on the powder keg of emotions that would lead to the actions he took that day. The first was the growing animosity towards his mother. We can only imagine that with his views on women and his mother in particular, he took major offence to being lectured by a woman, especially one that he saw as the root of a lot of his problems. The second catalyst, it is theorised, was the fact that just the night before, on the 11th of August, Jake's Reddit account had been suspended due to inappropriate comments he had made towards a 16-year-old girl on the platform. Could it be that the feeling of being suddenly outcast from the one place he had felt at home, accepted and understood, and the place that acted as his release valve for his rage, had sent him over the edge? Whatever the reason, what Jake did next would shock the city of Plymouth to its core and force the establishment to ask questions of what they could have done better to avoid this situation. Whilst Maxine had locked herself in her room and called her sister for help, Jake, it seems, had retrieved his shotgun. At approximately 6:05 p.m, after retrieving his gun, Jake then returned to his mother and found her hiding in her room, where he opened fire upon her twice, killing the one woman who truly had loved him immediately. Next, deciding that he now had nothing left to live for, he decided that he was going to go on a murderous rampage, taking out his pent-up rage on whoever would cross his path. And so he then made his way outside, where he came upon a man called Lee Martin and his 3-year-old daughter Sophie, who was simply out enjoying a stroll in the street. As Lee looked up from his daughter for a second, he noticed a hulking figure in the street with what looked like a shotgun pointed directly towards him and his daughter. Without thinking, Lee dove in front of Sophie, hoping to deflect the blast of the gun and save his daughter's life. Unfortunately, however, his efforts to save his daughter would be in vain after a barrage of shots rang out. The pair were left dead on the pavement where they had fallen, and callously, Jake simply walked past them, not giving the pair a second thought. As he continued down the street, he noticed a 53-year-old woman and her 33-year-old son through their front door window, and raising his shotgun, he took aim and then released another barrage of shots through the glass, injuring the pair, but fortunately for them, not seriously. Once again, after firing at the mother and son, he simply carried on walking along the road, searching for his next victim, who just happened to be 59-year-old Stephen Washington, who had been to a nearby park taking his dog for a walk. Jake had come across him on his rampage and simply decided to shoot indiscriminately, killing him on the spot for no other reason than having been in the same street as Jake on that fateful day. Next, Jake continued on to Henderson Place, where he came upon a 66-year-old woman called Kate Shepherd, who was standing in the doorway of a hairdresser's. Once again, he took aim and without giving her a chance, shot her down in the doorway, where she fell and began to immediately bleed out, later being rushed to hospital but unfortunately dying due to her injuries. At this point, police had had multiple calls alerting them to the presence of an active shooter in the area, and they were deployed immediately to deal with the threat. Upon the police nearing the scene, the sirens could be heard, and as they grew closer, Jake decided that enough was enough, and that it was time to take one final life on this murderous killing spree, his own. As the police reached the scene, Jake turned the gun around, pulled the trigger, and took his own life there in the street, rather than face the consequences of his heinous and devastating actions. Jake's actions that day raised multiple questions regarding the system around the police's policies regarding firearm permissions and whether Jake should ever have been given a license at all, causing the Devon and Cornwall Police Force to investigate their own failings fully, with reform being put in place immediately. It also leaves a lot of questions surrounding the police handling of Jake's mother's reports about Jake's behaviour, and whether, if they had been taken more seriously, this tragic event could have been prevented. On August the 12th, 2021, police in Moab, Utah received a concerning call from a traveller passing a Moonflower Community Cooperative in the Moab, Utah area, with the caller describing how they witnessed a couple arguing and then seen the man slap the woman across the face. Police were immediately sent to investigate the allegations, and upon their arrival, the pair were back in their van, travelling towards Arches National Park, Utah, driving erratically and at speed. And so the police decided to pull them over and speak to them about the allegations. When questioned separately, they both spoke about how an argument had started over something trivial, and how things had become more and more animated, with the man trying to lock the woman outside of the van to make her calm down, and eventually with them both coming to blows and admitting to striking each other, with the woman even admitting to being the one who hit the man first. Of course, the police were suspicious of the situation, but there was little they could do due to the both of them taking responsibility, and so the police simply chalked it up as disorderly conduct, and neither of the pair were arrested. Instead, the pair was separated for the night, with police taking the man to a hotel and the woman being left in the van. After a little bit of time apart and a decent night's sleep, the pair met back up the next morning and carried on their journey together. The pair in question were Gabby Petito, a 22-year-old aspiring YouTuber and van lifer, and Brian Laundrie, her 23-year-old boyfriend and travel companion. And the pair had recently set off on what they described as a life-changing trip across the country, visiting national parks and monuments and documenting their journey for their YouTube channel and Instagram as they went. The couple, who had lived in Northport, Florida together at Brian's parents' house before the trip, had set off on the 2nd of July 2021 and had been updating their social media channels with regular updates as they went, posting pictures of the places they were visiting and videos of them both as a couple, portraying what looked like the ideal relationship as they did. However, away from social media, the pair's relationship was said to be fraught with contention and frustration, with regular arguments and fights being recorded by multiple family members and witnesses along the journey. Another one in particular happened at a restaurant in Jackson, Wyoming on the 27th of August, where Brian was described as being hostile and heated with both Gabby and the staff, whilst Gabby was reported to have been emotionally distraught and sincerely apologetic about the situation to the staff. The pair were then, later on in the day, captured on CCTV together at a nearby grocery store shopping, with Gabby and Brian then deciding to drive out of the store car park and towards the Bridger Teton National Forest Park, the next stop on their journey. Since leaving on their trip, Gabby, who had a great relationship with her family, had been staying in regular contact with her mum, calling her and sending her regular updates over text. But since the 26th of August, after Gabby posted her final post on Instagram, very little had been seen on social media, and her regular updates to her family had suddenly gone quiet too. On the 27th of August, Gabby's mother received a text message from her daughter's phone that said, "Can you help Stan? I just keep getting his voicemails and missed calls." This message was incredibly peculiar, as the message referred to Gabby's grandfather Stan, but Gabby never ever referred to him as Stan. She then received another message on the 30th of August that said, "No service in Yosemite." On September the 1st, Brian Laundrie turned up at his parents' home in the van he shared with Gabby. But the unnerving thing was that Gabby wasn't with him. On the 11th of September, after not hearing from Gabby since late August, Gabby's mother decided it was time to go to police and filed a missing person report. Almost immediately, the case was picked up by the media and went national, with millions of people online across America getting behind the case and making it go viral, creating a massive amount of awareness. The police, who were beginning to build a picture of Gabby's last movements, had reached out to Brian and his parents and found them to be completely uncooperative at this point. Due to their lack of cooperation, police set up surveillance on their house, and on the 13th of September, they saw Brian leave in his car. On the 15th, they saw his car return to the home and believed that he also had returned. On the same day, Brian was made a person of interest in the case, and when police issued a search warrant to find Brian, they discovered that he had not returned home on the 15th with his car, and that it was actually his mother who had returned in the car. They did, however, find out that Brian had gone hiking at Macabre Creek Environmental Park, but that he was due to return in a couple of days. On the 17th of September, Brian had still not returned from his hiking trip, and so Laundrie's parents decided to report him missing. During the national coverage of Gabby Petito's disappearance, the police asked anyone that might have seen her or her van across the period of the 25th of August up until around about the 11th of September to come forward in order to try and figure out exactly where she would have been across that time. They suspected that she may have been staying at the Spread Creek dispersed camping area just outside of Jackson, Wyoming, and again asked anyone that might have witnessed her there to come forward. Pretty soon, hundreds of people reached out with possible sightings of Gabby, Brian and their van, but Kyle and Jen Bethune in particular came forward with some vital information. Kyle and Jen were a couple of van life bloggers who were on a similar trip to Gabby and Brian, driving from national park to national park while documenting their journey. And one of the stop-offs they made was at Spread Creek camping ground. They remembered having passed the couple's van as it was parked up in a camping area at the camping grounds, and having looked through their video footage, they found a video of the moment that they passed Gabby and Brian's van. This information was monumental in helping the police locate the area that Gabby had last been in, and police immediately set up a search of the specific area that the van had been in the video. On the 19th of September, not far from where the van had been parked in the camping ground, human remains matching the description of Gabby Petito were found. Her identity was confirmed and an autopsy of her body confirmed the time and manner of death. Gabby had died from blunt force trauma to the head and neck and manual strangulation, which had occurred approximately 3 to 4 weeks before her body was found. Immediately, Brian became the #1 suspect. After it was also found he had used Gabby's debit card to obtain more than £1,000 across the period of August the 30th and September the 1st. Brian's sister even went on national TV to encourage Brian to hand himself into the authorities on October the 5th, but this fell on deaf ears. On October the 7th, a large-scale search across the Carlton Reserve, Sarasota County, Florida, and in the adjacent Macabre Creek Environmental Park got underway, with Brian's father joining investigators in searching for his son. And on October the 20th, exactly 1 month after Gabby's body had been found, Brian's skeletal remains and some of his belongings were found in the Macabre Creek Environmental Park, in an area that had recently been underwater due to flooding. It was later found that Brian had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Within Brian's possessions was a notebook wherein Brian had detailed what had happened on the fateful day that Gabby had died, and how he had been responsible for her death. However, throughout the notebook, he tried to defend his actions by claiming that he did it as a mercy killing after Gabby had been severely hurt during a fall. He said, "I ended her life. I thought it was merciful, that it is what she wanted, but now I see all the mistake I made." The notes end with him detailing his reasons for his suicide, in which he says, "I am ending my life not because of the fear of punishment, but rather because I can't stand to live another day without her." Experts who examined Gabby's body and investigated the case have said that Brian's account does not match the findings and that Laundrie is simply trying to save face, with Michael Alcazar from the John G. College of Criminal Justice commenting that Laundrie was someone who doesn't want to own up to what he did and was trying to find justification for his actions. After documenting these 3 cases, I feel it's important to say that my thoughts and condolences go out to the victims and the families and friends of said victims that we have covered today. And the reason that I feel so strongly about these cases in particular being so dark and evil is down to the fact that each of the murders were committed by someone or to someone who was close to the victim. Whether it was a partner, a father, or a child, these were all people who the victims believed they could trust with their lives, but would come to learn that this just wasn't the case. And as someone who truly believes that family is everything, I truly believe that this is the darkest type of crime that someone can commit. And on that note, thank you all for watching, and if you enjoy watching videos about true crime just like this, then please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And of course, I'll see you in the next one when it will once again be time for more true crime.